Virgin billionaire BET, she'd beg on Christmas with divorce papers. Instead, she gave a gift he'd spent months setting this trap, carefully cutting off Layla's credit cards, freezing their joint accounts, making sure she felt the sting of life without his billions. The divorce papers sat ready on his desk, each page a weapon designed to leave her with nothing. She'd come crawling back. They always did. Women like her from modest backgrounds in Atlanta didn't survive long without men like him. What happens when the richest man in the room discovers his wife knows his darkest secret? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. The tech billionaire who never let anyone close found himself stripped bare on Christmas Eve by the one woman he thought he owned. In her hands wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was evidence that could destroy everything he'd built. The secret she carried would force the man who prided himself on purity to face the dirtiest truth of his past. What happens when the richest man in the room discovers his wife knows his darkest secret? Have you ever thought you knew someone completely, only to discover they were hiding something that changed everything? Tonight, a marriage built on lies will crumble under the weight of one devastating truth. But the real question isn't what Layla knows. It's what she plans to do with it. Follow along as we uncover a story that proves money can't buy you love, silence, or forgiveness. Hit that like button if you're ready for a Christmas tale that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power and redemption. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. She walked into his glass fortress like she owned it, because after 2 years of his cruelty, she finally understood something he didn't. Power isn't always about money. The lodge perched against a mountain like a crystal cathedral, all sharp angles and transparent walls that revealed everything inside while protecting nothing that mattered. Nolan Drake sat in his leather chair, swirling champagne that cost more than most people's cars, watching the snow fall on Christmas Eve. At 38, he'd built a social media empire that connected millions of people while keeping himself perfectly isolated. Tonight felt different. Tonight, his plan would finally work. He'd spent months setting this trap, carefully cutting off Layla's credit cards, freezing their joint accounts, making sure she felt the sting of life without his billions. The divorce papers sat ready on his desk, each page a weapon designed to leave her with nothing. She'd come crawling back. They always did. Women like her, from modest backgrounds in Atlanta, they didn't survive long without men like him. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. She signed the papers. It's done. But something felt wrong. The text came too easy, too quick. Layla had fought him on everything for months. Why give up now? He remembered their wedding night 2 years ago, how she'd trembled under his touch, how he'd claimed her body like another acquisition to master. She'd whispered she loved him that night, and he'd felt nothing but satisfaction at owning something so pure, so untouched by his world. Back then, she'd looked at him like he hung the stars. Now she looked at him like he'd stolen them. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its sound cutting through the silence like a blade. Have you ever been with someone who made you feel invisible, even when they were touching you? Drop a comment if you felt that cold emptiness, because what happened next will show you what happens when someone finally stops being invisible. The doorbell chimed at exactly midnight, and Nolan's champagne glass paused halfway to his lips. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Layla stood in the falling snow, but she wasn't alone. 2 years ago, she'd been a Southern belle who believed love could soften any heart. Tonight, she was a woman who'd learned that some hearts are made of ice that never melts. Layla moved through his domain with the grace of someone who no longer feared the predator. Her red coat, a slash of defiance against his monochrome world. Beside her stood a man Nolan recognized from wedding photos. Marcus, her lawyer brother from Atlanta, the one who'd warned her against marrying a man like him. Hello, Nolan. Her voice carried none of the warmth that once made his name sound like music. The Southern accent he'd once found charming now cut sharp as winter wind. Marcus stepped forward, briefcase in hand, every inch the protective brother who'd watched his sister's light dim over 2 years of marriage. We're here to collect some things. Things? Nolan stood, his height usually intimidating. Tonight, neither visitor flinched. Layla pulled a small wrapped box from her purse, setting it on his marble coffee table with steady hands. No trembling now. No tears. The transformation stunned him. Where was the woman who used to beg for his attention, who'd waited up nights hoping he'd come home? "That's yours," she said, her fingers steady as stone. "Open it when I'm gone, unless you want your family to watch you break." The way she met his gaze without flinching stirred something he'd forgotten existed beneath his control. This wasn't the scared girl he'd married. This was someone else entirely, someone who'd learned to fight back. When did you realize you were stronger than you thought? That moment when you stopped being afraid? Share that turning point below, because Layla's transformation is about to teach this billionaire a lesson he'll never forget. Her brother checked his watch. "Plane leaves in 3 hours. We need to move." "Plane?" Nolan's voice cracked slightly. "Where are you going?" Layla smiled. Not with warmth, but with the cold satisfaction of someone holding all the cards. "Bangkok." The word hit him like a physical blow. How could she possibly know about Bangkok? When she placed the box on his marble coffee table, her fingers didn't tremble. "Open it when I'm gone," she said, her southern accent sharper now. "Unless you want your family to watch you break." The man who built an empire on secrets was about to discover that his wife had been building something too, a case against him that could cost him everything. Alone in his glass fortress, Nolan stared at the black box sitting on his coffee table like a loaded gun. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, but the sound felt distant, muffled by the roar of blood in his ears. Bangkok. How did she know about Bangkok? He'd been so careful, so methodical about compartmentalizing his past. The business trip 6 years ago was buried under layers of corporate records and NDAs. Only 3 people knew the truth about what happened there, and one of them was supposed to stay silent forever. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. The box is just the beginning. Check your email. His hand shook as he opened his laptop. The subject line made his blood freeze. What really happened in Bangkok? Memories flooded back. The conference that ran long. The hotel bar where he'd met her. The way Siriporn's laugh had cut through his loneliness like sunlight through storm clouds. For 2 weeks, he'd been someone different. Not the calculating CEO, not the emotionless machine his father had raised him to become. Just a man desperate to feel something real. He'd made her promises in the dark, whispered words of forever while her body moved against his with a passion that terrified him. She'd been everything his sterile world wasn't. Warm, spontaneous, alive. And when she told him she was pregnant, he'd done what he always did when emotions threatened his control. He ran. The email loaded slowly, each pixel revealing his destruction. Photos of a woman with kind eyes, a boy with his stubborn chin, a life he'd paid lawyers to make disappear. Have you ever had something small completely consume your thoughts? That one thing you couldn't ignore? Tell me about it in the comments, because for Nolan, that small box is about to become the biggest mistake of his life. The box sat on the table like a black hole, its presence warping everything around it. The crackling fire seemed dimmer. The champagne tasted bitter. Even the mountain air felt thin. Inside, he knew, was proof of the one time he'd lost control. The one time he'd let his heart make decisions his head couldn't justify. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The box is just the beginning. Check your email. When he opened his laptop, the subject line made his blood freeze. What really happened in Bangkok? Every powerful man has a secret that could destroy him. Nolan's was sleeping peacefully in a mansion halfway around the world, waiting to wake up and ruin his life. The laptop screen glowed like a confessional window as photos loaded. A woman with kind eyes, a boy with Nolan's stubborn chin, a life he'd paid to forget. Email after email revealed a story he'd convinced himself was ancient history. Siriporn Thanakit, 28 years old when they met, working as a translator for international conferences. Beautiful in a way that made him forget about board meetings and profit margins. She'd laughed at his terrible attempts at Thai, taught him to eat som tam without crying, showed him parts of Bangkok tourists never saw. For 14 days, he'd been human. He'd walked through street markets holding her hand, eaten lunch from food carts, made love in her tiny apartment while monsoon rain drummed against the windows. She'd seen through his corporate armor to the lonely boy underneath, and for the first time in his adult life, he let someone that close. Then she told him about the baby. The photos showed what happened next. His hasty departure, the wire transfers to keep her quiet, the legal documents ensuring she'd never make contact. But they also showed what came after. A 5-year-old boy named Cayman with his father's eyes and his mother's smile, growing up in a world where daddy was just a ghost who sent money but never letters. His chest tightened as he scrolled through images of birthday parties he'd missed, first days of school he'd never know about, bedtime stories he'd never read. The passionate affair in Bangkok hadn't just been about losing control. It was about finding something he'd never experienced before. Connection, love, the terrifying possibility of being known completely and chosen anyway. What would you do if you discovered your partner had a whole other family they never mentioned? How do you forgive the unforgivable? Because this story is about to get a lot more complicated. The final email contained 2 attachments: DNA test results and a plane ticket to Seattle. His son was coming to America, and Layla had been the one helping him get a visa. The truth hit him like a sledgehammer. His wife hadn't just discovered his secret. She'd made contact. She'd built a relationship with the family he'd abandoned. And now, she was bringing them home for Christmas. The final email contained 2 attachments: DNA test results and a plane ticket to Seattle. His son was coming to America, and Layla had been the one helping him get a visa. In Bangkok, Siraporn had spent 5 years teaching her son English for one reason. So when the time came, he could look his father in the eye and ask why he wasn't worth staying for. 6,000 miles away, in a small apartment overlooking the Chao Phraya River, Siraporn Thanakit zipped her suitcase with hands that no longer shook when she thought about Nolan Drake. The small apartment buzzed with the energy of a woman who'd turned abandonment into armor. Every corner filled with evidence of a life she'd built from the ashes of broken promises. Cayman sat on the floor, carefully packing his few toys into a backpack decorated with cartoon elephants. At 5, he asked the kinds of questions that cut deeper than any lawyer's threat. Mama, why doesn't Daddy live with us? Will he like me when we meet him? Did I do something wrong? Each question was a knife twist in her chest, but Siraporn had learned to transform pain into power. She'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through law school, studying American family law with the dedication of a woman planning war. She'd taught herself perfect English, then taught it to her son, preparing for this moment when silence would no longer be enough. The letter from Layla Drake had arrived 8 months ago, written in careful, respectful Thai that proved the American woman had done her homework. Your son deserves to know his father, it read, and his father deserves to face what he's done. It wasn't an alliance born of friendship. It was 2 women united by one man's capacity for abandonment. Layla had been discarded after 2 years of marriage. Siraporn had been discarded after 2 weeks of love. Both had learned that Nolan Drake's heart was a fortress with no doors. When Siraporn packed Cayman's birth certificate, she remembered the morning she'd told Nolan about the pregnancy. He'd gone silent, that calculating look crossing his face like storm clouds over clear sky. Within hours, he was gone. Within days, lawyers called offering money for silence. Within weeks, she understood she'd fallen in love with a ghost. Have you ever had to explain to a child why someone who should love them chose to leave? What would you tell them? Drop your thoughts below, because this mother's answer is about to change everything. The boarding announcement echoed through Suvarnabhumi Airport in Thai and English. Cayman held her hand, his small fingers tight around hers as they walked toward the gate. In her purse, she carried 2 things: Layla's carefully crafted plan and her own promise that her son would never again wonder why his father didn't want him. As Siraporn boarded the plane with 5-year-old Cayman, she clutched the letter Layla had sent. Not just an invitation to Seattle, but a battle plan that would bring them all together for Christmas morning. While Nolan was building walls to keep the world out, Layla was building bridges to bring his past home, and she'd been planning this Christmas surprise for 8 months. Layla's Atlanta apartment had become a war room over the past year. flight confirmations printed and highlighted, legal documents organized in color-coded folders, phone numbers mapped out like a general plotting the perfect campaign. Every surface told the story of a woman who transformed heartbreak into strategy. The investigation had started small. A credit card charge from Bangkok she questioned, then dismissed. But something about Nolan's reaction, the way his face went blank, the way he'd changed the subject so smoothly, had planted a seed of suspicion that grew into certainty. She'd hired a private investigator not for divorce proceedings, but for truth. What she'd found had broken her heart all over again, but this time the pieces had reformed into something harder, sharper. A woman, a child, a pattern of abandonment that made her own suffering part of a larger story. The hardest part hadn't been finding Siriporn. It had been reaching out. What do you say to the woman whose life your husband destroyed before yours? How do you build trust with someone who has every reason to see you as the enemy? But Siriporn had surprised her. Instead of anger, there had been recognition. Instead of competition, there had been solidarity. Two women who'd learned that loving Nolan Drake was like trying to warm yourself by touching ice. Her memory turned to the night she discovered Nolan's laptop password. Not her name, not their anniversary, but the name of his high school girlfriend. The woman who'd gotten away before she could be discarded. That's when she'd understood she'd never been his wife. She'd been his latest acquisition, valuable only as long as she stayed perfectly in place. Her phone rang at exactly 3 a.m. Siriporn calling from the Seattle airport, her voice careful but determined. "We're here," she said in accented English that made each word sound like a small victory. "Is he ready to meet his son?" Layla smiled in the darkness of her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of the girl who believed in fairy tales. "He's about to be. When someone betrays your trust completely, do you walk away quietly or do you fight back? What's the difference between justice and revenge? Tell me in the comments, because what Layla does next will redefine both." Her phone rang at 3 a.m. Siriporn calling from the Seattle airport. "We're here," the voice said in careful English. "Is he ready to meet his son?" Layla smiled in the darkness. "He's about to be." The doorbell rang at sunrise on Christmas morning, and when Nolan opened it, he came face to face with the ghost of every choice he'd tried to bury. Sleep had been impossible. Nolan had spent the night pacing his glass fortress, the black box sitting unopened on his coffee table like a ticking bomb. Every time he'd reached for it, his hands had frozen. Some truths were too heavy to lift alone. The Seattle sunrise painted the mountains in shades of gold and gilt as he stumbled toward the front door in his silk pajamas and designer robe. His empire was built on perfect timing, calculated moves, strategic advantage. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. The boy stood on the threshold like a living mirror, reflecting back every feature Nolan saw in his own reflection, but softened with his mother's warmth and curiosity. 5 years old, clutching a stuffed elephant, staring up at him with eyes that held no anger. Only the devastating innocence of a child meeting his father for the first time. Behind Cayman, Siriporn stood like a guardian angel wrapped in winter clothes. 6 years had changed her, strengthened her, turned the soft translator he'd left behind into someone who could cross oceans for her child. She was more beautiful than his memories, but harder too, like a precious stone that had been cut and polished by suffering. "Daddy?" Cayman's voice was small, uncertain, perfectly bilingual in the way of children who grow up between worlds. The word hit Nolan like a physical blow. He'd imagined this moment in his nightmares for years, but nothing compared to the reality of looking into eyes exactly like his own and seeing hope instead of hatred. Siriporn's gaze met his over their son's head, 6 years of separation crackling in the space between them. "Hello, Nolan," she said, her English careful and precise. "I think it's time you met your son. What would you do if someone from your past showed up at your door with a child you didn't know existed? How do you handle that moment when your carefully constructed world collides with the life you left behind? Share your thoughts, because this collision is about to get even more complicated." As Cayman asked in perfect English, "Are you my daddy?" Layla's car pulled into the driveway. The 3 most important women in Nolan's life were about to meet, and only one of them was on his side. In the space of one morning, the man who controlled everything found himself surrounded by the three people who could destroy him, and they were all holding hands. The lodge's open floor plan, designed for entertaining and impressing, became a courtroom where every glass surface reflected his guilt back at him in fractured pieces. Nolan stood in his silk pajamas facing a jury of his own making. His abandoned son, his discarded lover, and his ex-wife who'd orchestrated it all. Layla entered last, her red coat like a battle flag in his sterile world. She looked at Siraporn with a recognition of shared wounds, at Cayman with the gentleness of someone who understood abandoned children, and at Nolan with something that might have been pity. "Introductions seem unnecessary," Layla said, her southern accent crisp in the morning air. "But let me be clear about why we're all here." Cayman, oblivious to the adult currents of anger and abandonment, explored the massive living room with wide eyes. Everything was bigger than their tiny Bangkok apartment. The Christmas tree, the fireplace, the man who was supposed to be his father but felt like a stranger in expensive clothes. "I want to go home," Cayman whispered to his mother in Thai, his small voice cutting through Nolan's chest like broken glass. "We are home, little one," Siraporn replied in English, her eyes never leaving Nolan's face. "This man owes us that much." The weight of 6 years of silence pressed down on the room. Nolan had built his fortune on making hard decisions quickly, but faced with his son's confusion and his ex-lover's quiet strength, he found himself paralyzed. "I can explain," he started, his voice hoarse. "No," Siraporn cut him off, her voice gentle but immovable. "You can listen. For once in your life, you can just listen. Have you ever seen someone's true character revealed under pressure? When a mask comes off, what do you see underneath? Because what happens next will show you what a man is really made of." When Cayman climbed onto Nolan's lap and asked, "Why didn't you come back for me?" The billionaire who never cried felt something break inside his chest that money couldn't fix. Some men crumble when their house of lies collapses. Others finally learn how to build something real from the wreckage. Cayman's small body felt impossibly light in Nolan's arms, like holding a butterfly that might fly away at any wrong move. The boy's question hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. "Why didn't you come back for me?" Snow continued to fall outside the windows, each flake a small surrender to gravity, blanketing the sharp mountain peaks in softness that seemed impossible just hours before. Inside the lodge, something equally impossible was happening. Nolan Drake was learning what it felt like to have his heart break completely. "I was scared," he whispered, the words foreign in his mouth. He'd never admitted fear before, not to business rivals, not to himself, certainly not to a 5-year-old boy whose only crime was existing. Cayman tilted his head, studying his father's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Mama says being scared is okay, but running away isn't." Siraporn watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. 6 years of raising their son alone had given her the kind of strength that came from having no choice but to be strong. She'd seen Nolan at his most vulnerable in Bangkok, when he'd whispered his fears in the dark and made promises he couldn't keep. Now she was seeing him broken in a different way, by the consequences of his own choices. "Your mama's right," Nolan said, his voice thick with years of suppressed emotion. "Running away hurt people I should have protected." Layla stood by the window, watching the snow fall like tears she'd never let herself shed. This wasn't her fight anymore, but she couldn't leave. Some stories demanded witnesses, and this was the moment when a selfish man either stayed selfish or chose to become something better. What does it take for someone to really change? Can you forgive someone who genuinely becomes a different person? Share your thoughts below, because what happens next will determine whether this family can heal or if some wounds run too deep for second chances. As Nolan tucked Cayman into the guest room bed, the boy whispered sleepily, "Mama said you were lost, but now you're found, right?" The question followed him into the hallway, where 2 women waited for his answer. 3 adults, 1 child, and a lifetime of hurt. Some wounds need space to breathe before they can begin to heal. The lodge's dining table became a negotiating surface where coffee cups marked territories and legal papers drew new maps of a family that had never existed as one. Morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the atmosphere inside felt heavy as thunderclouds. Layla sat across from Siriporn, two women who should have been enemies, but had found common ground in shared abandonment. Between them lay custody documents, visa paperwork, and financial agreements that would reshape 3 lives forever. Nolan sat at the head of the table like a king whose kingdom was crumbling, watching 2 queens divide his world without asking permission. "I want him to know his father," Siriporn said, her English precise despite the exhaustion in her voice. "But I won't let him be hurt again." Cayman played quietly in the corner with toys Nolan had hastily ordered online at dawn. Expensive gadgets that couldn't replace 6 years of bedtime stories and scraped knee kisses. The boy seemed smaller in a massive room, a reminder of how much space money could buy, but how little it could fill. "Joint custody isn't realistic with an ocean between us," Layla pointed out, her lawyer training making her the voice of reason no one wanted to hear. "Someone has to make a choice." The weight of that choice pressed down on Nolan like altitude sickness. Move to Bangkok and lose everything he'd built, or stay in Seattle and lose the son he'd just found. Either way, something precious would be sacrificed on the altar of his past mistakes. Siriporn reached for the same document as Nolan, their fingers brushing in an accidental touch that sent electricity up his arm. 6 years hadn't erased the connection between them. It had just buried it under layers of hurt and disappointment. "I have conditions," she said, pulling her hand back like she'd been burned. "Name them," Nolan replied, his voice rougher than intended. "No more running. No more disappearing when things get complicated. If you're going to be his father, you're going to stay his father. When families break apart and try to rebuild, what matters most? What's fair or what's best for everyone involved? Tell me in the comments. Because the choice Nolan makes next will determine whether this story ends in redemption or more heartbreak." Layla stood to leave, divorce papers signed and sealed in her purse, but stopped at the door. "There's one more thing," she said, pulling out her phone. "The media knows. The story breaks in 6 hours. The man who built his fortune on privacy was about to learn that some secrets are too big to bury, and some consequences arrive with cameras and headlines." News vans lined the mountain road like metallic wolves, their satellite dishes pointed at the lodge like weapons designed to broadcast his shame to the world. Nolan watched from his bedroom window as reporters set up equipment in the snow, their breath creating clouds of vapor that looked like smoke signals announcing his downfall. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Board members demanding explanations, investors threatening to pull funding, reporters offering money for exclusive interviews. The empire he'd built on control was cracking under the weight of one truth he couldn't manage or manipulate. Downstairs, Siriporn helped Cayman eat breakfast while shielding him from the chaos outside. She moved through his kitchen like she belonged there, making toast and finding juice cups with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to create home wherever she landed. The sight of her in a space stirred something dangerous in his chest. Not just desire, but belonging. "Daddy famous?" Cayman asked, pointing toward the window where camera flashes exploded like lightning. "Something like that, little one," Siriporn replied, her voice carefully neutral. But her eyes met Nolan's across the room with a look that said everything. This was his mess to clean up. The press conference had been Layla's idea. Get ahead of the story before it got ahead of them. Control the narrative while there was still a narrative to control. She'd arranged everything from her hotel room, orchestrating his public confession like a conductor leading an orchestra toward crescendo. "You have 2 choices," she told him over the phone. "Tell the truth on your terms, or let them tell lies on theirs." Standing at the podium 20 minutes later, microphones thrust toward his face like accusations, Nolan felt more exposed than he had in the Bangkok hotel room, where Cayman was conceived. At least then, his vulnerability had been private. When your private business becomes public, what matters more? Protecting your reputation or protecting the people you love? Drop your thoughts below because what Nolan says next will either save his family or destroy what's left of his world. The reporter's question cut through the press conference chaos. "Mr. Drake, will you be seeking custody of your son?" Nolan looked directly into the camera, and for the first time in his life, told the complete truth. Standing in front of the world's cameras, Nolan Drake had to choose between the man he'd always been and the father his son deserved him to become. The press conference podium felt like a confessional booth broadcasting to millions, each word either building bridges or burning them forever. Flashbulbs exploded around him like fireworks celebrating his destruction. But for the first time in years, Nolan felt completely calm. "Yes," he said into the microphones, his voice carrying across the mountain air to every news station in America. "I will be seeking custody of my son. But more than that, I'll be seeking his forgiveness." The crowd of reporters erupted with follow-up questions, but Nolan held up his hand for silence. Behind the cameras, he could see Siriporn standing with Cayman in her arms, watching him choose between his pride and his son. "6 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life," he continued, his words cutting through the winter air like blades. "I walked away from a woman who loved me and a child who needed me because I was too afraid to be the man they deserved." His stock price was probably crashing in real time. Board members were likely calling emergency meetings. Everything he'd built through calculation and control was dissolving under the heat of honest emotion. "Siriporn Thanakit is an extraordinary woman who raised our son alone while I hid behind lawyers and wire transfers. She deserves better than what I gave her. Cayman deserves better than what I gave him." The questions came faster now, sharper, designed to cut him open for public consumption. "Are you admitting to abandoning your child? Will you pay back support? Is this about guilt or genuine love?" Nolan looked directly into the camera that would carry his words into millions of homes. "This is about becoming the father I should have been from the beginning. This is about proving that people can change, even when they don't deserve the chance." What's the hardest apology you've ever had to make? When someone genuinely changes, how do you learn to trust them again? Share your story in the comments, because this public confession is just the beginning of Nolan's real journey. After the cameras stopped rolling, Siriporn approached the podium with Cayman still in her arms. "That was a good start," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 6 years. "Now show me you mean it." The way she looked at him suggested their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Love doesn't always look like fairy tales. Sometimes it looks like two broken people learning to be whole together while raising the child they created in the spaces between their mistakes. 6 months later, the Bangkok restaurant in Seattle's International District had become their neutral ground, a place where Thai flavors mixed with American hopes and the scent of lemongrass couldn't quite mask the nervousness of new beginnings. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Nolan met Siriporn and Cayman here, slowly rebuilding what he destroyed one shared meal at a time. Cayman had grown comfortable with him, no longer hiding behind his mother's legs when Daddy arrived. The boy chattered about school in mixed Thai and English, showing off drawings and spelling tests with the pride of someone who finally had a father to impress. Each small moment felt like a gift Nolan didn't deserve but treasured anyway. "He asks about you when you're not here," Siriporn said, stirring her Tom Kha guy with careful concentration. 6 months of co-parenting had softened some of her edges, but trust was still a bridge under construction between them. "What do you tell him?" Nolan asked, watching his son color a picture of what looked like their restaurant family. 3 stick figures sitting around a table that took up most of the page. "That you're learning how to be present," she replied, her English more relaxed now. "That learning takes time." The physical space between them had been shrinking over the months. What started as opposite sides of the table had become adjacent seats, hands brushing when they both reached for Cayman, shoulders touching when they bent to help him with homework. The attraction that had created their son in a Bangkok hotel room hadn't died. It had just been buried under years of hurt. "I've been thinking," Nolan said, his voice careful, "about moving my company's Asia operations here, staying closer to what?" Siriporn interrupted, her dark eyes searching his face. "To you. Both of you. Can two people who hurt each other deeply, ever truly start over? What does it take to rebuild trust from scratch? Tell me what you think in the comments, because what happens between these two will determine whether some wounds can actually heal. 6 months later, as Nolan read bedtime stories in Thai he'd been learning from online videos, came and asked, "Daddy, do you love Mama again?" The answer surprised even him. The hardest person to forgive is often yourself, but the most beautiful love stories begin when someone else believes you deserve redemption before you do. The small house in Seattle's Beacon Hill felt more like home than his glass lodge ever had. Mismatched furniture and children's drawings on the refrigerator creating warmth no architect could design. Nolan had sold the mountain fortress, trading glass walls and marble floors for a neighborhood where kids played in the streets and neighbors actually knew each other's names. Siraporn stood in the kitchen making pad thai, while Cayman did homework at the dining table, his tongue poking out in concentration as he practiced writing his English letters. The domestic scene should have felt foreign to a man who'd spent his adult life in boardrooms and five-star hotels, but instead it felt like coming home after being lost at sea. "The R goes the other way, little one," Nolan said, guiding their son's pencil with gentle fingers. Teaching had never been in his skill set, but watching Cayman's face light up when he got something right was better than closing any business deal. "You're good at this," Siraporn said from the stove, her voice carrying surprise and something that might have been admiration. "I'm learning," he replied, their eyes meeting across the small room with the kind of understanding that comes from shared purpose. The kiss happened without planning, sparked by the simple moment of her wiping flour from his cheek while he helped make dinner. 6 years of separation collapsed into that single touch, tentative at first, then deeper, tasting of forgiveness and possibility. "You grown-up stuff," Cayman declared from his homework station, but he was grinning when they broke apart. "Sorry, buddy." Nolan laughed, the sound foreign but genuine. "Sometimes grown-ups get mushy." "It's okay," Cayman replied with the wisdom of someone who'd watched his mother be sad too long. "Mama smiles more when you're here. When someone proves they've really changed, how do you open your heart again? What does earning trust back actually look like?" Share your thoughts below, because what these two discover next will change everything. The pregnancy test sat on the bathroom counter like a question mark, 2 pink lines offering a future neither of them had planned for, but both secretly wanted. 2 years later, the man who once measured love in transactions was teaching his son that the best things in life, family, forgiveness, second chances, can't be bought, only earned. The backyard in their modest Seattle home buzzed with laughter as Cayman pushed his baby sister on the swing set, her delighted squeals mixing with his careful Thai lullabies. At 7, he'd become the kind of big brother who took his job seriously, explaining the world to 2-year-old Molly with the patience of someone who remembered what it felt like to have questions no one would answer. Nolan sat on the back porch with Siraporn, watching their children play in the golden light of a Pacific Northwest sunset. His empire still existed, but he'd restructured everything to work from home, choosing bedtime stories over board meetings, family dinners over business trips. The trade-off had cost him billions on paper, but given him riches he'd never known existed. "Remember when you thought money could fix everything?" Siraporn asked, her hand resting on the small bump that would become their 3rd child in 6 months. "Now I know better," he replied, pressing his palm over hers. "Money can't buy back time. It can't purchase forgiveness. It can't create love." Molly stumbled in the grass, skinning her knee on a hidden rock. Before Nolan could move, Cayman was there, scooping up his sister and carrying her to the porch with the kind of protective instinct that made his father's chest tight with pride. "Daddy fix," Molly demanded through her tears, holding out her scraped knee like an offering. As Nolan cleaned the wound and applied a colorful bandage, he thought about the boy in Bangkok who needed his father to fix things, scrapes and bruises and the bigger hurt of abandonment. He couldn't go back and heal those wounds, but he could make sure his children never wondered if they were worth staying for. "Better?" he asked Molly, who nodded solemnly before running back to play. "You're different," Siraporn observed, watching him with the kind of love that comes after surviving everything together. "I had good teachers," he replied, kissing her temple as Cayman called for them to watch his latest playground achievement. What would you do differently if you could start over? How do you break cycles of hurt and build something beautiful instead? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story proves that the most powerful transformations happen when we choose love over fear. The evening air filled with the sounds of a family that had been broken and rebuilt stronger. Children's laughter, parents' quiet conversation, the simple music of people who'd chosen each other despite everything. Inside the house, photo albums documented their journey from separate lives to shared dreams, each picture proof that some stories do get the endings they deserve. If this story of redemption and second chances touch your heart, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about love that conquers mistakes, families that choose each other, and the power of starting over. Tell me in the comments, do you believe people can really change? And remember, the most beautiful love stories aren't about perfect people, but about imperfect people who choose to grow together.